Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's deep dive into one issue affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan. Ex-astrophysicist, now Hobbesian realist. Not many people can pull off that social media profile statement. In fact, there's likely only one, Professor Gerald Steinberg, the founder of NGO Monitor. Steinberg is an emeritus political studies professor from Bar Ilan University, and among his other realms of interest, he is an expert in human rights, soft power, and non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. He's delved so far into NGOs that in 2002, he even founded one himself, the Institute for NGO Research, which is a recognized organization in Special Consultative Status with the UN Economic and Social Council since 2013. NGO Monitor aims to promote accountability and discussion on the reports and activities of NGOs claiming to advance human rights and humanitarian agendas in Israel. A word that came up several times in our discussion is hypocrisy. So this week, I, Amanda Borschel-Dan, ask NGO Monitor's Professor Gerald Steinberg, what matters now? Gerald, thank you so much for joining me today in our Jerusalem offices.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Such a pleasure. And of course, NGO Monitor is really an institution, but I'd like to hear about the genesis of your work that brought you to founding this institution. How did you get started in this realm? I think originally you were more of a scientist, no?
Well, way back when, about 40 years ago, maybe longer, I was a student in astrophysics, a researcher in California, with a side activity. I think I got a degree in something like Middle East studies or something like that while I was working on my physics and astrophysics. That was a long time ago. But I always had this connection to Israel, and what I call the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. I did politics. I was interested in politics and applying what I thought was this sort of scientific method, rationality, evidence, all of that, to politics. And that I drifted into international relations and for various reasons. And I didn't do anything connected with NGOs, but for 20 years I did this combination of where science, international politics, nuclear weapons, satellite imaging, all those things, where they all converged. When I finished all my degrees and came here in 1982, started to teach in those areas, and that's what I did for roughly 20 years until the late 1990s. I never thought about and never wanted to establish an institution. I was perfectly happy being an academic and going around the world and doing what I did. But in the course of doing that, certainly in the late 1990s, when I went to conferences that had to do with disarmament and arms control, nuclear weapons, landmines, I would see more and more of a presence of people handing out material, NGOs. I didn't know what an NGO was, or if I did, it wasn't significant. It wasn't something that was taught or researched in international politics. And most of these were sort of side organizations that were not significant. Volunteers, well-meaning, Amnesty, we knew about them, but they weren't part of the general curriculum. But I began to see how much influence they were having. This was the late 1990s. In various places like the Human Rights Council in Geneva, it was called the Commission, in the Conference on Disarmament, which is in the same compound in Geneva, in various other frameworks, in government frameworks, in Congress and elsewhere. NGO leaders would be talking about Israeli, even in those days, violations of human rights and war crimes. And I said, I began to see this as significant to the work that I was doing then. And okay, I'm an academic, I have tenure, I'll spend a little bit of time, I'll do some research on this, because it was not at all on the agenda, on the radar of international politics. Well, that was 20-something years ago. Then came the infamous anti-Semitic Durban Conference on the elimination of racism and the NGO forum that was there, which I didn't go to, but I was involved with on the side. I was asked, began to talk to Israeli government officials about the importance of these things. And they didn't want to be, they weren't interested. We only deal with governments. We don't deal with non-governmental organizations. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do it myself. And that's really the origins of what then turned into NGO Monitor, but was really designed as a 3-year academic project.
And NGO Monitor is an NGO, correct?
NGO Monitor is a registered NGO. It's called the Institute for NGO Research. In Hebrew, המכון למחקר לארגונים לא ממשלתיים, because you can't use an English phrase like NGO Monitor to establish an Israeli nonprofit. Long story, but that's the summary of it.
Okay, that's very funny. And what is an NGO? What is the classic definition of NGO?
That's an excellent question because it's complicated. I'll do it short. The term NGO originated with the United Nations after the end of World War II in the late 40s and early 50s. It was a different United Nations than we have now. It was dominated primarily by the United States. And in order to, in some ways, balance or offset the tendency even of democratic countries to turn into dictatorships and the anti-democratic corrupt elements, as we learned from Germany and the Weimar Republic, that was the image that was strongest in the policymakers' minds. We should have non-governmental organizations as a form of checks and balances against the excesses of democracies. So the United Nations established at the very beginning a framework which would encourage and allow NGOs, the right ones, the ones that were given permission, the registered ones, to participate in the activities of the United Nations. And so there's something called the Economic and Social Council, which now we're talking about 2024, so we're 75 plus years later, has admitted about 5,500 NGOs as registered to participate in the United Nations, not as voting members, but for instance, the Human Rights Council, an NGO, has the right to speak after the government representatives have all spoken. And NGO Monitor is also a registered NGO. That's a relatively long story itself, but it doesn't make much difference now. And we go to the meetings of the Human Rights Council and take our turn, 90 seconds, 60 seconds, after Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and all the others have condemned Israel for all sorts of violations. NGO Monitor, same thing is true for UN Watch and B'nai B'rith International. There are about maybe 15 NGOs compared to maybe 200 that are anti-Israel. There are about 15 that I would say are not in that category.
So you're very careful with saying you're not in the category of being anti-Israel, but would you say that part of your purview is essentially being pro-Israel?
Formally, and it's more than formally, we are a research institute, and that's how we're registered in Israel and the UN and elsewhere. We look at, and particularly because of the origins back in the days of the Durban Conference, non-governmental organizations that are active in the realm of human rights. We're Jerusalem-based. I'm an Israeli, so therefore we look at NGOs that deal with human rights that also are active in the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli broader context. That almost by definition becomes looking at organizations that are repeatedly declaring Israel to be war criminals, to genocide, apartheid, starvation is the latest aspect of that. And that's been going on for 20 years. And so we do look and criticize, or I should say maybe the better term is critique, analyze, using research tools, what the claims are and what we can find in terms of verifying or non-verifying those claims.
There are, of course, pro-Israel NGOs such as Shurat Adin or Im Tirtzu or organizations of that caliber, shall we say. Are you also researching them?
No, we only deal with organizations that are clearly involved, almost always declaring themselves to be human rights groups. And that does not apply to Shurat Adin or Im Tirtzu. There's also questions about, we look at funding, for instance, and when funding is hidden, that's a different story. So most of these organizations are transparent in their funding. The ones that are, we might call openly pro-Israel, they're quite transparent in their funding. We look specifically at ones that get funded from European governments, where the funding process is very hidden and murky. So that does put us in a certain category, but that's more as by default. We don't have any policies on issues like occupation over the green line, however one wants to define that. We always have a problem with language. Do we talk about the West Bank? Do we talk about Judea and Samaria? Do we have a slash in between them? That's a constant issue because we try not to be identified. We have different views in our organization. We have 15 staff members, most of whom are researchers, and the positions on those issues are all over the place. That's not our issue.
It's true that that little slash can mean so much when you're talking about a lot of these groups that you're researching. There's Israel/Palestine, and that's just become common parlance, wouldn't you say?
Yes, that has been, and I think I find that disturbing. I'm certainly a Zionist. I don't take ideological positions within the Israeli framework, but I'm a Zionist, and it bothers me that it's not Israel and Palestinian Authority, which perhaps would present some sort of equality or a comparative basis. Palestine, I have trouble defining what that is. But yes, that slash is all over the place. Language is very important, and a lot of what we deal with is language. There's a big difference between saying there are accusations or there may be alleged war crimes and saying Israel commits war crimes. But that nuance is almost completely absent from the NGOs that we look at.
Right. Hashtag genocide, hashtag apartheid, right?
Yeah, okay. You can go anywhere with the hashtag, but I think there is a very strong difference. I'll say this phrase, this cliche, context counts. But when you have an organization like Human Rights Watch that puts out a 245-page report ostensibly documenting the October 7th atrocities and doesn't mention the word tunnels doesn't exist or underground, nothing. They carefully choose their language. So if they use Israel, hashtag Palestine, but omit one of the most essential parts of the conflict, then I think you see that in a broader framework.
A lot of these organizations, let's turn it back a little bit more to the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. It appears to me that they were created by what we would call here in Israel, Yafei Nefesh, meaning people who have good intentions and who wanted to put a spotlight on some kind of atrocity, not necessarily Israel. It could have been the nuclear warhead movement, correct? And then they proliferated from these kind of well-intentioned people into, it seems like, more of a corporate culture in so many of the bigger organizations now, such as Human Rights Watch that you mentioned, or Amnesty International. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely. I agree with every word you said. The first group, the first NGO that was seen, recognized, and accurately as a human rights group was Amnesty International. It was founded in the mid-60s. Certainly the term altruistic applies. Also, usually those organizations at the beginning were based on volunteerism. They had small budgets. They had very limited access to resources. And they focused on very specific issues. Amnesty originally began to focus on the prisoners of conscience. And they would send their volunteers would send thousands of postcards, mostly behind the Iron Curtain. It dates me back to in those days, but this was the 60s, Soviet bloc plus China, but also countries, dictatorships in Latin America, South America, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. They would also focus on those. But NGOs tend to morph. They were very successful. And eventually, actually, the founders, who were Jewish and had connections to Israel, were pushed out. Retired, pushed out, they're different versions. And individuals with far more focus on political agendas which were not based on this universalist principles took over. And the same thing almost happened with Human Rights Watch, very similar. Founded later by Bob Bernstein, altruistic, came back from the Soviet Union, having signed a bunch of translation agreements. He was head of Random House Publishers, and signed translation agreements, Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov and others, and felt he had to do something about the political prisoners in the Soviet Union. And that was the beginning of US-based Human Rights Watch. Amnesty was founded in London. And they were going to be more research-oriented. Well, Bernstein retired, and it was taken over by a group of ideologues, anti-American. The NGO world tends to attract people who are anti-nationalist, anti-Western, anti-capitalist. One school of thought says that these are continuation of the Marxism of earlier decades. And then you get to intersectionality, post-colonialism. Now I'm getting into my 14-week course and throwing out all those terms. But I'm reinforcing every word that you said. that they begin as altruistic, largely volunteer groups, and then they become multi-million dollar, euro, pound organizations. Human Rights Watch has an annual budget of $100 million a year. That's a corporation, but no checks and balances. Amnesty, 330, I think, million euros a year. No external, nobody knows how Amnesty works, how they pick their leaders. Even people who are relatively high up in the Amnesty framework in different countries has said to me, we have no idea how they pick their Secretary General. It's even more cloudy or smoky than the Vatican.
It sounds almost like a cult, but you mentioned that initially there's this registration process. Is there no kind of weeding out at that level?
Well, there are different registrations. To be a nonprofit or an NGO, or sometimes it's called civil society organization, most democracies have a formal process, but there they mostly check due diligence, financial records, and other things. Occasionally, if an NGO completely strays from its declared objectives, then they can be questioned, but rarely shut down. And that happens in the Charity Commission in the UK and IRS in the US and elsewhere. But then there's a second level, or different independent level, I would say, and that's in the UN, which is entirely political. So you can have an NGO back in the days of Gaddafi. You would have not just one, I think, a number of Libyan NGOs that were admitted to the United Nations as bona fide human rights organizations. And you have Chinese groups and others. That's entirely political. And I'll just add that NGO Monitor was admitted after many years of being refused, like 5 or 6 years. We were always asked about our position on the right of the Palestinians to self-determination and questions like that, which we said is not relevant, but then they wouldn't admit us. But one day, I think it was a Syrian representative who was supposed to veto us. This is during the Syrian civil war. Didn't show up, may not have come back to the UN, and they admitted a lot of these organizations, including ours, that had been vetoed for many years by that framework.
That's just fascinating, everything you're saying. And I just wonder about in my eyes, hypocrisy of all of these different movements. Of course, when it comes to Israel, I'm here. I am an overt Zionist, as you said as well. And it just seems that it's objectively, it seems as if there's too much attention being paid to one tiny little country when you put countries such as Libya or China in the same rubric, and they're not getting anywhere near the attention that Israel is.
There are a lot of reasons for this. It's absolutely correct. And at one point, I spent a lot of time, and then other researchers did the same thing, following up. How many pages? How many posts? How many reports? How many press conferences? And the numbers, the hypocrisy, or the complete lack of any kind of symmetry. Israel's way up there off the charts. And everybody else, Iran, Russia, everybody else is down, I won't say in the mud, but very few compared to Israel. And that obviously raises all those questions. First of all, there's a money issue. And some of the money, a lot of the money, is not visible. It's not transparent. We know from leaks that Human Rights Watch got 3 million in additional funds, 3 million euros from Qatar in 2018. There was a leak of a letter on that, and other sources like that. So when you have a lot of money, and being under American or British or Canadian or any other Western democratic tax frameworks does not require you to disclose all of your donors. So foreign donors, that may be changing, but foreign donors are not being reported, and that's a real problem. So if you have a large amount of money going to anti-Israel propaganda, those organizations are going to get some of that, a significant amount of that. Another aspect is that these are organizations now largely run by people who have a political philosophy which is anti-Western, and Israel is the biggest target. It's huge out there. You want the United States, if you're Ken Roth or a head of one of these organizations, there's a constant demand the United States stop providing fund, not just economic support, but weapons. That's a big campaign now. So there's an ideological aspect. Third aspect is the alliance with the United Nations, specifically in the Human Rights Council, where in Geneva, it's a very depressing, fascinating theater of hypocrisy, to use your word, and I absolutely agree with that. That you go to the Human Rights Council, meets 4 times a year, plus emergency sessions, and there's always the agenda item 7, permanent agenda item 7, only on Israel. And you have a special rapporteur who has a long history of really blatant anti-Semitism, an Italian Marxist. All those factors come together. So the obsession with Israel is been cultivated and developed and partly explained or largely explained by all these factors. It's been there for a good 20 years, and it's just been getting worse and worse.
At least 20 years. I mean, the whole Zionism equals racism, that's 1975. That's the year I was born. I'm pretty old by now. And
Don't go there with me.
So it's generations of people being raised on this ideology. It boggles my mind. Of course, I'm sitting here. But let's talk about what's happening right now since October 7th. And you mentioned already the idea of Gazan starvation. There's also the denial of sexual assault. There's all sorts of things that seem very blatant that are being twisted around and even not acknowledged by certain NGOs that we think would be acknowledging them. Let's start with the denial of sexual assault, for example. Did you see the denial playing out, and did it surprise you in any way?
I'm not sure it surprised me, but it certainly depressed me and many, many other people who I've had conversations about this issue with, that organizations that are considered and often described as highly respected world's experts promoting human rights either deny or put major question marks. It's now almost 10 months. And Human Rights Watch issued this big 245-page report ostensibly on the atrocities. But they say in a couple of places, Human Rights Watch could not confirm independently the accusations of rape and sexual assault. The videos are out there. The material is there. What does that mean? They couldn't confirm it. And they have all these other accusations about all the terrible things they allege Israel does. And that's just one example out of many. And there are women's groups that have, again, in part of that NGO world, many of them, that have either denied or raised questions or manufactures this false comparison. Well, the IDF has reportedly also sexually assaulted Palestinians, so we're not going to take a position on this. Yes, it's very depressing, probably not shocking or surprising, watching the track record of these organizations. These are political groups, and they political in a very, not in a balanced way, but in a very hostile way. And this is something that Israel is the favorite target, and that's the result that we get.
I think neither of us would say that Israel is blameless, correct? I think both of us would agree that there are some issues that the country needs to rectify, even quite a lot. And it's quite possible that a lot of the NGO's work does help Israel renegotiate and get back on track in certain areas. Let's take the idea of humanitarian aid. And it appears to me, and I'm no expert, but it appears to me that the attention that was placed on it allowed Israel to amplify the measures that the country has been giving to Gaza since October 7th. At the same time, there's this echo chamber of starvation, of genocide, purposeful genocide, while Israel is indeed delivering this aid to the Gaza Strip.
There's a lot of issues in there, and it's a very complicated thing, and I want to unpack it a little bit, not go too far. I mean, generally, I agree with you that there are, in a course of a very, very bitter war, but we're talking about 20 years also in Gaza, at least from the disengagement of 2005, that the accusations have been there continuously. Not of starvation, although even back probably around the time of Goldstone, what was called Cast-led, the first Gaza war, there were some of those accusations were already there. But the point is, there's a menu, and the NGOs and their UN allies, these are all work together. They go through the menu systematically there's no real attempt to analyze what the facts are. the IDF and COGAT, which is part of the coordinator of I think whatever it is, government activities in the territories, which is responsible from the Israeli perspective in bringing food and water and medications in. They claim that they did the best they could during the first months of the war. It's hard to get an independent assessment. But certainly since then, the evidence has been out there that the amount of food that's gone in has more than doubled, and there are all sorts of assessments by qualified nutritionists that the amount of food going in to Gaza is much more than the minimum necessary to survive, and is in a low level, but among what poor countries generally provide to their population. But the accusations of starvation haven't slowed or stopped at all. They don't care about the facts. And this is a combination. The NGOs put it out there. Very often journalists will pick it up and repeat it without bothering to check. Sometimes there's an ideological alignment. Sometimes it's, well, these are well respected. Then it goes on to government people. And of course, the UN is repeating the same thing. So all of those are all aspects of this very complicated situation we're in. If there was a normal, I don't know what that term means, but I'll put it out there, a relationship between the Israeli government, NGOs, the United Nations, other governments, sitting around a table. We have a problem. We think you are not bringing in enough food. You should do something about this. Then you could have, in my view, a normal response. But we don't have anywhere. We get not just shouts, but accusations, and we're going to indict and arrest the prime minister and the defense minister on allegations of starvation, International Criminal Court prosecutor. And that gets to the point of complete absurdity. That's not problem solving. And NGOs that claim that they are there to help solve problems are doing the opposite. I'll give you, if I can, just a story from my own background. I used to give presentations, I guess lectures is the right word, to groups of Army soldiers at various levels, officers and newly enlisted and all that, and part of the educational process. And in the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years, when I would do that, I would always get the response from a number of soldiers that, why should we care? Why should we bother? We're going to be called war criminals whatever we do. And my response is there's a moral position and you should act accordingly. Not just that, but there's also an IDF code of conduct, and we should operate according to that code of conduct. But the accusations, the constant accusations of being war criminals, including from Israeli organizations, and that soldiers tend to be most sensitive to that, actually has the opposite effect of creating an atmosphere where these values are in fact accepted and inculcated. And I find that also depressing.
But at the same time, I think it's quite clear that not every behavior is 100% on any front from any country, no matter how moral they're attempting to be. So do you see that there is a place for these NGOs to offer critique to governments, to armies?
Well, I think we go back to the issue of hypocrisy here. If these NGOs, we're talking about, but there are different levels also, they're the big superpowers, then there are the Palestinian groups, the Israeli groups, the European groups, different audiences, different levels of intensity and different capabilities. But if we would see organizations in this network, let's say 100 different organizations, very round numbers, that would try to balance and say, let's look at other wars, I think that would have a much more attentive Israeli audience. But they don't. Some of the organizations say, we only look at Israeli violations. We don't look at, that's not our mandate. Well, that doesn't help in creating that type of confidence that there's serious analysis here, that we can take it seriously. So clearly, I would like to see much more of a wider scope. There are a couple of exceptions, which you've probably never heard of, and most of the people listening have probably never heard of, because they don't get the headlines and the money and everything else. A group called Human Rights First. Never heard of them. Based also in New York. I think it was once called Lawyers Committee for Human Rights or something like that. And they criticize Israel. They criticize another 30, 40 countries. Every year I see their reports. But they are, I don't like the term balanced because that sounds artificial. But I think that if you look at those reports, Israel doesn't stick out as they're going after Israel particularly and very specifically. There's not the double standards, but you don't hear of them. They don't get the headlines, and they don't get the huge amounts of money. Another organization that is trying to offset the hypocrisy and the imbalance, the Raoul Wallenberg, I think it's Center for Human Rights, which was created and run by Professor Erwin Kotler, from whom I learned a great deal about when I made that transition into a human understanding NGOs and human rights issues. I learned a lot from him. And he has a center based in Canada, but it has branches, I think, in Israel and other countries as well. Named after Raoul Wallenberg, who was basically disappeared and apparently lost his life, where he was active in trying to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. So those are the types of organizations where they also will criticize Israel, but again, in a way that is not highly disproportionate, absurdly disproportionate.
So on the subject of absurdity, you were invited to take part in a debate at the Oxford Union, and this is a very, well-publicized and famous debate system that has a lot of YouTube life for sure. And what I found interesting from the invitation that they sent you was the second line said, "This House recognizes Israel is an apartheid state responsible for genocide," meaning this must be the topic of the debate, and it's presented as if there is no debate at all. Your response was well publicized, I would say. And can you just share with us a little bit about your reaction?
I look at these debates, and there are a lot of them now, as sort of the back to Rome 2,000 years ago in the Colosseum, where you've got Christians, probably some Jews too, and the lions. It's a spectacle. And you have this blood-hungry crowd cheering on whatever they see as long as there's blood on the floor. It's not an academic, intellectual exercise. And the phrase, that is the title of the debate that they want to have. And that is Israel an apartheid genocidal state? I've forgotten the exact phrasing, but yes, resolve that. Well, I'm not going to get up there and debate something where the end is going to be, I'm going to be eaten by a lion. There's going to be a very, a crowd that is very hungry for action, for really nasty hits from both sides. That's not me. And even if it was, that's not something, I'm not going to accept the terms which automatically put Israel as completely unique. No other country is described in that kind of language. And that's part of the process of preparing the way so that actually Israel is prepared for elimination. If Israel is an apartheid genocidal state, they have no right to exist, like apartheid South Africa. That's part of this process. So I wrote a response. I will say that probably about 15 years ago, I did participate. It was the other side of the Oxford-Cambridge, at the Cambridge Union. I've forgotten the topic, but it was something about Israel and Zionism, which was not entirely determined or written in a way that makes Israel obviously the worst country out there in the world, the worst state in the world. And it was fun. It was interesting. It was fun. And there was a two-person team, and the person, I've forgotten who it was, but it was someone who had experience, a member of the British Parliament, who was brilliant in that kind of debate situation. I provided the facts, the information, and he did the one-liners, which were great. So there was entertainment in there, and I think some information was passed on. But this is not the Oxford Union now is not trying to do that. And in my response, I reminded them of their history, including anti-Semitic topics in the past, including back in 1939, a debate about whether the British people should fight for king and country against Hitler. That's a very ugly background for what is supposed to be a student framework for intellectual discussion. And that's what I responded. I said, anybody participating is acting immorally. I may have to eat some of those words because they will have the debate, and there'll probably be some very good people who will be against the resolution, but I still think it's a spectacle that should not be held.
And so we look forward to that in the fall, apparently.
I'm not sure I'm going to look forward to it, but I'll certainly listen or watch with interest.
Gerald, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan. If you have any comments or questions about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Until next week, Shalom.